What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Monday, September 11th, 2017 here, start of a brand new week here, anniversary of the 9/11 events. We'll be getting into that a little bit later in the show here. Right now, the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble. Ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Obviously, the storms continue to be the major news here. These poor people in Florida, parts of the Florida Keys have been devastated by Irma's surge. They've got record flooding in quite a few cities all along Florida. Last night, Irma had been downgraded to a tropical storm, but as it approached Tampa, the wind started to pick up again, and now it's a Cat 1 hurricane as of the last report here. Apparently, cars and mobile homes were overturned, smashed. Half the state is without power right now. They are trying to get fuel into Florida right now. The governor of Florida was just on TV trying to urge calm for everybody because they're just running out of gas, they're running out of heating oil, and they're trying to get fuel into those people just as hard as they can. And it's kind of weird here to understand how many trillions of dollars the U.S. government spends arming itself against nations that have not actually done any harm to the United States, and has spent precious little of our tax money getting us ready to deal with these natural disasters, which are going to come. It's only a matter of when they're going to happen. Now, over in the Caribbean, they're still dealing with the aftermath of the weather, as well as apparently massive looting is taking place. And really, people, you shouldn't be going out and doing that for two reasons. One, it's just dishonest and unethical and immoral. Two, you're risking your own safety going on out in these conditions. And apparently some of these looters got caught on a TV broadcast and got arrested, so there's another reason to maybe tone it down and just realize it just really isn't worth it breaking into that Foot Locker and saving a bunch of running shoes from drowning here. Irma has prompted the first ever tropical storm warning for Atlanta, and the storm is continuing up the center of Florida. And it is really, really nasty. Downtown Miami is underwater. It's all completely flooded from that storm surge. The storm surge was so powerful in this storm that some of those Caribbean islands, the water in the ocean literally got sucked away from the beaches. And that was something a lot of people weren't expecting, and certainly they'll never get to see that again in their lifetime. We hope. Now, unfortunately, a little bit of bad news about Hurricane Jose. The last couple of days, it had sort of been meandering back and forth, couldn't make up its mind what it was going to do. It was aimed at Bermuda, then it curved off east, then it came on back and just sort of jumbled around. Now it appears to have sort of gotten out of that confused cyclic behavior, and unfortunately, it is now tracking to the northwest, and it is aimed at Florida or somewhere along the eastern seaboard. So, you know, it's really amazing. You see all these people are out there saying, well, the U.S. government's weather creation machine is doing this for whatever reason. There were tweets out there saying that Donald Trump did this as an insurance scam so that all of his properties that get destroyed, he gets to rebuild them at the insurance company. If you're going to get that wacko, let's just say that Florida had evidence that could put Hillary Clinton in jail. And that's why they're getting all these hurricanes here. So it is a serious, serious situation. Again, please donate to the Salvation Army or any other charity that you can be sure is going to actually get the money there. And by the way, yes, the Clinton Foundation is now raising funds for hurricane relief in Florida. And if you remember that situation in Haiti, how much they raised and how little actually got to the people of Haiti, probably would be well advised to stick with the Salvation Army on that one here. Now, obviously, today is the anniversary of 9/11, and the government is celebrating by having all these little speeches. Donald Trump was out there speechifying at the memorial, and everybody's out there trying to reinforce the official story. The cable TV channels the whole last week have been running all these things about, 9/11, this is what happened, this is what happened, just trying to resell the official story over and over again. But in the 16 years since 9/11, the U.S. government has proven that they hate our freedoms just as much as the terrorists. Remember when Bush got up there and said, well, they're doing this because they hate our freedoms, which was one of the most ridiculous things to ever come out of the mouth of a politician. Nobody hates freedom except those who are trying to be in control. Politicians, religious leaders, corporate leaders, they all hate freedom. Ordinary people like you and I, we love freedom. We love our freedoms. We love it when the other people are free. But if you look at how many freedoms we've lost, we've got the TSA groping us at the airport. Now we're seeing attacks on the First Amendment, that it's got to be moderated and controlled because you can't criticize Israel or anything else. Our freedoms are under attack, but it's not from the terrorists. It's from our own government. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. And so going back on in and looking at 9/11 from 16 years on, a lot of people are wondering, was this the U.S. government's version of the Reichstag fire, which, as you know, was set by Hitler's own people and framed on the communists? And it allowed Hitler to grab totalitarian power, the enabling acts, and transform Germany from a democracy into a dictatorship. And it looks like that was the agenda on September 11th, 2001, a transformative event. And remember, back in the 1990s, there was this group called the Project for the New American Century. And they had a policy paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, where they were talking about having to have this massive military buildup to support 100 years of endless war against the rest of the world. And buried in there was a comment that it was going to take a really long time, absent a transformative event like a new Pearl Harbor. So even back then they were saying, gee, wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of a major event where the American people would get on board with suspending the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and making war on all these countries, none of whom have attacked us, by the way. So let's go on back and take a quick review of the many reasons why the official story is doubted by so many people. First and foremost, the really obvious one, the BBC report on the collapse of World Trade Center Building Number 7, the Salomon Brothers building. And the BBC announced that at 21:54 Greenwich Mean Time on September 11th, 2001. There was only one problem. The building didn't actually collapse until 26 minutes later. And if you look at the video of the BBC's reporter reporting on the collapse of the building, you can see it behind her, still standing. So there was a script, and somebody got off the timeline. Now, another aspect of it has to do with the Israeli spy ring. And in the month before 9/11, the FBI uncovered the largest foreign spy ring ever caught operating inside the United States of America, operating on behalf of Israel. And Carl Cameron at Fox News did a 4-part story on it. And one of the things that was buried in that story was that there is evidence linking these Israelis to 9/11, but it was classified by our own government. Then there are, of course, the 5 dancing Israelis arrested on 9/11. People were looking out of their windows at this horrible tragedy going on, and they saw these Israelis who had shown up before it even began to happen, set up cameras and tripods, and when the buildings were crashing down, they were dancing and high-fiving and cheering, and the police got called on them, and the police caught up with them, and these Israelis said, we're not your problem, the Palestinians are your problem. And ultimately, it came out that 3 of them were Mossad agents. And even though there was evidence linking them to 9/11, according to that Carl Cameron report, they were eventually sent back to Israel, where they were treated like heroes. They were on talk shows all over the place about how they were there to document the event. And finally, here's a real big one. okay? And the article is called "The Secret Service at Booker Elementary, the Dog That Did Not Bark." And that's a reference to a Sherlock Holmes story called Silver Blaze, where Sherlock Holmes deduces that the owner of the home is the criminal, because when the crime was taking place in the dead of night, the dog did not bark. The dog would have barked if it had encountered a stranger, but because it encountered its own master, it stayed quiet. The dog did not bark. That was the piece of evidence that pointed to the owner of the home as being the criminal. So now you have George W. Bush down there at the Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. And in theory, the official story is this is a surprise attack. Nobody knows what's going on. 2 planes have been flown into the World Trade Towers. It's a terror attack. Everything's going on. And what do we see the Secret Service do? Absolutely nothing. There's an airport only 4 miles away from the school. Now, normal practice would be to grab the president, throw him in that armored limousine, and start driving in a random direction to foil a possible inbound. Did not happen. The Secret Service lack of any action whatsoever tells us they knew President Bush was not a target that day. And the only way they could know President Bush was not a target that day was they knew ahead of time what the targets were going to be. So then there was that anthrax frame-up. Remember all the letters that were being sent to members of Congress and the media, and the envelopes were written, and the letters were written to look like semi-literate Arabs. You know, we're coming for you, booga, 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 booga. Then it turned out the anthrax that was actually inside the letters came from our own biological weapon laboratories. Little bit of an embarrassment there. Now, a lot of people have studied 9/11 over the years, and last year there was a report published in Europhysics News. This is a highly respected European physics magazine, peer-reviewed. And the conclusion of this article was that all 3 World Trade Center towers collapsed on 9/11 due to controlled demolition. It is most obvious, obviously, with World Trade Center 7, which was not struck by an airplane. And yet you see it just coming right down into its own footprint, looking like a controlled demolition. And there's no way that can happen just from a fire. And remember, before World Trade Center 7 and ever since, no steel frame building has collapsed just from fire. And World Trade Center 7 was built beyond the normal building code because it was a building that housed federal offices. So it was built extra sturdy, extra bomb-proof, extra fireproof, and still it came down right into its own footprint. And the only way that could happen is if every single load-bearing member failed at the exact same moment, which is simply not plausible from the idea that it came down from the fires inside. And then there are all the photos that came on out showing very obvious demolition marks on the remains of the World Trade Center itself. We've got one of those on the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. So it looks like thermite cutter charges were used to weaken the buildings and bring them down. And the remains, the combustion remains of thermite were detected within the building, along with this uncombusted nanothermite that was found in the debris. Now, you remember last year, Donald Trump was out there campaigning. He was out there in Bluffton, South Carolina, and said, if you elect me, you'll find out who really knocked down the Twin Towers. I'd sure like him to keep that campaign promise. All the way back in 2001, right after 9/11, Trump was interviewed about how those buildings came on down. Was it some kind of a failing, the structural failing or engineering? And back then, Donald Trump said, no, it wasn't an architectural defect. These were very strong buildings, and they were bombed. 2001, Donald Trump said these buildings were blown up. Another indicator about the use of thermite is how long the fires burned in the core of the wreckage. They burned for months. Now, the only way that makes sense, again, is if there's these pools of melted thermite down at the bottom, extraordinarily hot, and thermite doesn't require outside oxygen. Fires that are of like office materials, paper, and so forth and so on, they have to have oxygen. With all that wreckage on top of them, they would have been snuffed out. Plus, there was all the water that was pouring in there. But thermite does not require outside oxygen, because the oxygen is present in the iron oxide, which forms 1/2 the formula for thermite. And water can't extinguish thermite because it boils off to steam before it can even get in touch with it. Then there's Lucky Larry Silverstein, who made out like a bandit. Everybody wondered why he fought so hard for that lease on the World Trade Towers. It was facing an EPA-mandated renovation because of the asbestos that had been used in the original construction. And these EPA-mandated renovations had bankrupted several other companies that owned buildings in New York. And yet, Larry wanted that lease. He wanted that building. And then we find on out that he was starting to design the new World Trade Center in April of 2000. So good old Lucky Larry, he just gets on in there, he gets that lease, he avoids the EPA-mandated renovation because the buildings are knocked down and all that asbestos is picked up by those first responders, many of whom are suffering ill after effects from exposure to all that asbestos dust. Remember when the head of the EPA went on down there and told those people the air is safe, you can work without special protection. And now they're all ill, they've got cancers, leukemias, mesothelioma. By the way, you know, Robert Mueller, who is currently the special counsel trying to find some way that they can impeach Donald Trump, he was made director of the FBI just 1 week before 9/11. Funny how the FBI directors get changed just before something happens. Same situation with the murder of Vincent Foster. Head of the FBI was replaced just that very same day. So this probably was a study in foregone conclusions, but we ran an online poll on whatreallyhappened.com. Do you believe the official U.S. government story on 9/11? 99% voted no. Now, Ron Paul has come on out there saying that the police state we are currently in was planned, and 9/11 just provided the opportunity to implement it through the passage of the USA Patriot Act. Remember how the Project for the New American Century talked about a transformative act? 9/11 was it. It transformed us from a democracy into a dictatorship with illusions of democracy, with massive election fraud. And let's not forget that other 9/11, which was the attack on the consulate in Benghazi. And I'm sure Hillary would say, what difference does it make at this point? Now, as you know, speaking of massive election fraud, there has been a bit of an upset in New Hampshire, where it turned out 6,000 people voted with out-of-state driver's licenses. Now, New Hampshire allows you to register to vote the same day you're going to vote. And there were all these people coming in, mostly from Massachusetts, who basically showed their Massachusetts driver's license, said, we just now moved here, we want to vote, and they voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. And auditors have gone back and looked, and what they found is these people who claim to have just moved to New Hampshire and voted with a Massachusetts or other out-of-state driver's license never got a New Hampshire driver's license to replace it. So it is looking like Hillary Clinton did not actually win New Hampshire. It was stolen from Donald Trump. And Trump still won through the Electoral College, but those additional 4 electoral votes would have made it more obvious that he was winning despite the massive election fraud. Now, the good news is that President Trump's Commission on Election Integrity is now up in New Hampshire looking at this. So they're starting to dig in on all of this. And not too surprisingly, the Democrats are panicking. Oh, how could you even suspect that this would be done? This is ridiculous. The Democrats never cheat on elections. But at this point, it's very obvious there was massive election fraud. There were the millions of illegal immigrant voters. There were all the games being played with absentee ballots. And this confirms voter fraud by out-of-state Democrats. The implications are huge. The implications are we absolutely do not have honest elections. And we all need to deal with that right now. We'll be right back. Put the volume up there, and welcome back to our show here. And by the way, with regard to that little requests for donations to RBN. Apparently, we had a rather large one, $500 come on in. The note specifically mentioned my show, which makes me blush here. But we wanted to do a shout out and express our gratitude because we really do need your help here. The only way we're going to get the big money corruption out of our society is for all the little money to unite together in that common cause of restoration of our republic. Now then, we're talking about election fraud here. And it does look like some people are trying to take the system seriously. Over in Virginia, there was a group called DEF CON. They're white hat security experts. And they showed that the electronic voting machines shared a single hard-coded password, meaning you couldn't take it out or change it. And Virginia then directed the Virginia Information Technology Agency to audit all the machines in use in the state. That's the AccuVote TSX, the Patriot, and the ABC Advantage. None of them passed the test. The Virginia Information Technology Agency said each device analyzed exhibited material risks to the integrity or availability of the election process, and the lack of a paper audit trail posed a significant risk of lost votes. So Virginia is now scrapping the electronic voting machines. And that's a good thing to have happen there. I have an idea. Why don't we adopt the Mexican system of elections? To vote in Mexico, every eligible Mexican citizen has to have a tamper-proof photo ID card with a thumbprint and an embossed hologram that demonstrates it's not been altered. All citizens are required to personally register and show proof of birth and citizenship to vote. Applicants are required to personally return and collect their ballots. There's no mail-in ballots. Why can't we upgrade to the Mexican standards without being called racist? Maybe that's because a certain political party has become dependent on illegal immigrants being allowed to vote. Now, Hillary Clinton is out there on her Sour Grapes tour and apparently not doing very well. The book is already being marked down. It only just hit the bookstores and already it's like 30% off. And so she's out there on her tour blaming men, blaming white people, blaming Donald Trump, blaming the independent media, blaming whatever for her lost election bid. And she's out there saying that she's not going to run for president again, but she's not done with politics. In other words, she's going to stay in there and just try and cause as much trouble as she can for Donald Trump. She's becoming the epitome of the bitter old lady. All right, let's talk a little bit about the wars. Those are still out there. Okay, U.S. troops and Russia-backed Syrian forces are set to come into contact as they close in separately on ISIS. This is inevitable because Russia's coming from one side, and the U.S. troops that are there are trying to get rid of the evidence of what's been going on, and they could come into contact. The question is, what's going to happen when it does? And there are a lot of people who are very concerned about what's going on with all these reports of U.S. helicopters evacuating the ISIS commanders, getting them out of harm's way, probably to use someplace else as justification for an invasion. Meanwhile, down in Mosul, since last July, over 2,000 bodies have been found in the western part of Mosul after the city was cleared from Daesh in June. So a lot of civilians got killed there. That is a tragedy as well. Now, once again, the head of the IAEA, which is the UN agency monitoring Iran's compliance with the P5+1 deal, says Tehran is honoring the agreement. And he's basically coming on out and he's standing firm against Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, who are out there saying, oh, Iran is in violation. They're violating the spirit. We've got to do something. And the head of the IAEA is saying, no, they're playing by the rules. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, and we're still dealing with technical issues. And this all goes back to last Tuesday when I was notified I had to update the Skype on this little laptop off to the side here, and that my Skype account would not work unless I did. As a matter of fact, I got the notice when I was trying to Skype somebody and was not able to get through to them. So I updated my Skype, and it is just absolute crud. I cannot receive phone calls, and apparently I just found out from our control room, their text messages to me are not getting through either. We've actually had callers waiting on the line, and I apologize to all of you who waited for a very, very long time. So let's clear up some phone calls. Dustin in New Jersey, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Hey, Mike, you know what's so obvious? How much of an inside job 9/11 was when the plane flies around the Pentagon into that record rooms area. Like right there, that tells you they had plenty of time in between the first Trade Center getting hit, the second, and then the Pentagon. They could have flew into nuclear reactors, but they didn't. They hit those two buildings in the Pentagon, which we know the Pennsylvania plane was heading to Building 7 most likely, right?
Yes.
So why those particular buildings? You know, all has to do with maybe economics and this new globalist world order, most likely.
Well, the reason the plane flew around the Pentagon and came in on the side it did, as you point out, it hit the offices where accountants were trying to find where those missing $3 trillion had gone. And so with the impact of that airplane, at that point, the evidence trail was gone. And wherever that money went, they got away with it scot-free. And, I think the fourth plane was definitely heading to World Trade Center 7, because if you look at the Nodé Brothers documentary on 9/11, and if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth watching. The firefighters that are on the ground in the remains of the two towers are told there is a third plane heading in. And obviously, it didn't get there. Either the flight crew got control of the plane back or whatever, and at that point it had to be shot down because what was on board the plane didn't match the official story. And there were witnesses who saw that plane over Pennsylvania being followed by a fighter jet with missiles on the wings.
You remember when Donald Rumsfeld and all of them were saying the people fought back on the plane and they fought and they crashed? No, that plane got shot down because the people fought back and took back control of the plane, or the pilots took back. The plane was shot down because they didn't want that plane to land. Well, that's the thing.
We know the plane was shot down. The wreckage was spread over 8 miles of countryside. That tells you it came apart at altitude.
And then people don't think, I know Saudi Arabia is not involved, but there's two parts of Saudi Arabia. You got the Saudi king and his group, and you got the Wahhabis. Now, Saudi Arabia, wasn't the Saudis put in by the British way back during the early empire, back in the day? And then the Wahhabis are a separate sect that they live with, but those are the ones in Syria, the Wahhabis, that they allow to go fight, and then they'll airlift them to another part of the chessboard, as we say, to fight in another area of the world. So basically like Afghanistan, they use them in the 80s, they move them out, they move them around, and they use them as a proxy army like the Romans did. And Mike, what a disgrace our government is. Not only us, the British, the French, and they're all involved in this, Mike. I mean, what a joke this whole thing is already. I'm glad the Syrians and the Russians kicked the crap out of these people. I'm really glad. I hope they die in the desert somewhere, these people. They're really either piece of garbage people, mercenaries, or prisoners, or whatever the heck they're using, but good riddance to them. And I hope they lose a lot to where the Saudis get a bloody nose, because eventually they're going to run out of people, the Saudis. Well, and the Qataris.
The last word we had from the Saudi Crown Prince is he wants to get out of Yemen. It's costing him way, way too much. He's not being reimbursed for his services by the U.S. government, and he definitely wants out of that now. Anything else, Dustin?
No, thanks, Mike. Have a good show.
All right, thanks. We're going to switch over to Bob in Missouri. Aloha, Bob. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Thanks for the forum. One thing people forget, too, the airline stocks were sold off the largest since their inception a week before planes went down down, they knew that people weren't going to be riding planes very often after so they knew about it too. It wasn't just the government. Hey, Mike, I want to ask you.
Yes.
What do you think about this Quest thing that they let that's half America, 143 million people. All their information got out, and that, you know what? It's done on purpose. They don't care. Just like Target let a lot of information get out. And you know why they don't care? Well, because the U.S. is going to pick up the losses for their store. And because you're not going to make the people that's got the credit cards, they won't get credit anymore. They won't buy a credit card, and the stores can't go out of business. So what they'll do is take their ill-begotten gains and just underground economy and keep buying things from the store and giving their friends all this money and everything. And you're getting trillionaires now, and they got billion-dollar yachts and stuff, and they're buying up islands. They got nothing to spend their money on or no time to do anything else and run the indigenous peoples off. And it's just, I just wonder where, we have a Christian God, we got a Allah, we got a Muslim, all this. Who's going to intervene in all this, Mike? I mean, it's just beyond mankind. And we are the most immoral nation in this world as ever known. We're the most socialized, that's for sure. But when you're $22 trillion and counting in debt, what kind of moral values can a country have like that? Tell the rest of the world they better pay up or use our dollar for oil or this, that, and the other. All we do is have a killing machine where Israel's bully boy to go around and soften up all these dictators' nets, except Israel getting bigger and better, I guess. And it's just, I don't know, mind-boggling, Mike. I'm sorry I'm bending your ears so much, but who's going to stop it?
I think it's in the process of stopping itself. The economy is completely out of balance and out of control. Trump is out there saying we're not even going to bother with the appearance of a debt ceiling any longer. So we're going to get into this hyperinflationary spiral until we wind up like Zimbabwe, where we've got paper notes that say $100 trillion on them. But right now, as the U.S. economy is entering this hyperinflationary cycle, other countries have got a strong motive not to be using the U.S. dollar anymore because it's not considered trustworthy and reliable. And we're hearing more and more talk about other countries that are going to delink from the dollar. We're going to be talking about that in the economic section of our talking points today. But I really do think it's starting to tear itself apart. And I'm still convinced that the U.S. federal government is going to collapse the way the former Soviet Union did. And I got to be honest, I think that would be the best thing for the entire world right now. It would bring all this war nonsense to an end. It would yank the rug out from Israel. They wouldn't have another armed power doing their dirty work for them. I think it would send a message through everybody on planet Earth that private central banking really is not a good way to run a nation's economy. And we could see a lot of changes. But I think we just have to stay calm and just understand. It does feel to me like it's really on the edge.
Yeah, and one last thing I'll leave you with. You know what we're going to do to North Korea? Zero, nothing. And China is, their little proxy. North Korea is for China, and China is condoning all this. They're going to keep trading with them and that. We've done too much to China. We've run off any friends that we could have possibly had.
Yes.
And including Russia.
Yes.
And so we're not going to do anything to North Korea. Hey, I thank you for the forum and the time.
All right. Thanks an awful lot, Bob. And we're going to switch over to Steve in California. Steve, thank you for waiting. What's on your mind? Steve, are you there?
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air.
Oh. Yep. Hey, Mike. You mentioned Hillary Clinton and her whining book tour. My mother called me this morning and said she heard, I guess, a little speech from her about how she became suicidal after the election was over because she was so despondent from losing. And I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty amazing that she would admit that because that shows how vulnerable and the instability of this woman. Of course, she wants to become the president of the United States, so that doesn't even leave a very good message in my mind. But,
Hillary has already said
she's not going to run again.
Yeah, which I wouldn't want to bet on that. Of course, I think if she sees an opportunity, she'll go for it. But yeah, for her to admit that indicates that yes, she's in a very. It was a pitiful bid for sympathy. Look what you did to me. I almost killed myself because you voters betrayed me. Blah 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 blah.
Yes, us darn deplorables. Make
Yes.
sure she didn't win. But, she said that she wouldn't run again, but, she understands the power, the controlling powers of the deep state. It controls the Oval Office, so she'll probably just go on that side over there,
Yeah, well, I think she's already over there. She's part of that narcocracy that's running this country. And obviously, Donald Trump has been completely corralled and controlled. I'm very disappointed in him, as I'm sure we all are at this particular point here. Anything else, Steve?
That's it. Hey, thank you, Michael.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to switch over to Don in Iowa. Aloha, Don. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Don, are you there? I think we lost Don.
Hello.
Don, are you there?
Hello. I'm here.
All right, you're on the air.
Yeah. When you're talking about the Democrats claim they could never rig any elections, there was an old folk singer named Steve Goodman. He was from Chicago. He said, this is one of his songs, when John Kennedy wanted to be president and he knew what to do, he called up Mayor Daley because he was Irish too. That's what happened in Chicago. Remember that?
Yeah.
Kennedy won the election with all the dead people voting in Chicago.
Yeah, Kennedy did steal the election. Richard Nixon got cheated, and he never forgave Kennedy for it, and may have been part of Kennedy's final demise. Certainly, Nixon was very much involved in the economics of Cuba. Two of his biggest supporters were PepsiCo and United Fruit, that were making huge amounts of money because Batista was selling Cuba's agricultural produce at way below market rates, which impoverished the Cuban people and enriched these American corporations. And Nixon if Nixon had actually won that election, we probably would have gone to war against Cuba. I'm not against Cuba. We probably would have had much better relations with Cuba. But when Castro came to power, Nixon was at the forefront of saying, we got to get rid of him. We got to take him out on there.
Right. As far as Hillary Clinton, hopefully this is going to be your last spouting her mouth off for the last time, and then it's all. That's what Cheney did. Cheney kept on going back on the TV shows, and finally they just said, "Hey, this guy is just a burnt-out old man. We have no business having him on any of these talk shows or anything." And Hillary is in that boat. She's writing another ridiculous book, and I'll be glad when I finally never have to hear anything about her anymore.
Well, I agree with you, but unfortunately, looking at Hillary and her ego and her vanity, I don't think she's going to go away until she actually dies. She's going to be out there attracting as much attention to herself as she can, and now she's playing, the sympathy card out there. And there are a lot of people within the Democratic leadership who just wish she would shut up and go away because she has become an albatross around the neck of the Democratic Party. And the longer Hillary is out there on her Sour Grapes tour, the worse and worse it's going to be for the Democrats in next year's midterm elections.
She's a horrible human being. Okay, I'll let you go, Mike.
All right, thanks an awful lot. And we're going to take a phone call from James in Texas. Aloha, James. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes. I want to get back to a couple of callers. You had said that you think this whole thing is on a cliff, and you're right. But what's on a cliff is the system that they made for us, because when you look at it, if they already have everything in place to outlaw gold and silver, because they already have you have that one law that was pushed in the Arab world that now gold is Sharia compliant, and that's just the best excuse that they could have. Because I mean, a good time, 9/11, never forget, terror. Now you got George W. Bush's war on terror all around the world, and every government just says, they're terrorists, and that's why we're going after them. Without even, nobody thinks about it anymore. And it's even worse than saying commie, because at least the communists, so-called, have nations. And now, anybody can be a terrorist. Anybody can be labeled a terrorist. And just think, that'd be the perfect thing to be like, hey, you have gold and silver? Well, the Islamic Sharia law, and when people hear that word, Sharia law, they're like, ugh. And I think that's, what do you think? Where did we become so scared? Or how did we become so scared?
Well, we live under a government and a corporate media that works continually to keep us afraid of everything, of germs, of viruses, of Muslims, of Osama bin Laden. And after a while, when you're spending all your time being afraid, that sort of becomes your normal state of mind, fearful. And that makes you easy to control.
Isn't that why you see freedom of speech being attacked so much? Because I remember when I was going to school in the 90s that they were charging kids. If you cuss, you would literally get charged with a misdemeanor and you're fined.
Okay, James, can I ask you a question? Can you move the mouthpiece of your phone closer to your mouth because you're sounding very muffled?
Hello?
Much better. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, so you're going to have to sum up.
Oh. Yeah, so what I was telling you about the free speech, I remember when I was going to school in the 90s, cuss words were illegal. Like well, they weren't illegal, but you would get fined, misdemeanor fined, and ticketed, the parents and everything. And do you think that's how they drip drop these things in, is they make something offensive that everybody is sort of on page with, and then they kind of turn it into...
Yeah, then they start spreading it out, saying, well, you didn't scream First Amendment when we were talking about curse words, so why are you making a big deal now? All right, well, listen, James, got to let you go. Got to take a break for commercials. Back with another phone call after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And before we take this next phone call, apparently downtown Jacksonville, Florida is flooded. And a flash flood emergency has been issued for Charleston County in South Carolina. So everybody just be appropriately cautious. And we're going to take a phone call from Glenn in Philadelphia. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I got to hand it to you. I never thought I'd hear someone be able to use the words upgrade, Mexican, and standard in a single sentence. But you did it today relative to the voter IDs. And when an overt narco-terrorist state is beating your semi-covert narco-terrorist state in equity at the polls, you're pretty far afield. Okay,
your phone signal to us is a little bit garbled. Can you talk a little bit closer to the mouthpiece?
Okay, you know what? I'm using my handset itself, not a Bluetooth, and normally there's no problem there. What I said was I got to hand it to you because I never thought I'd hear anyone be able to use the words upgrade, Mexican, and standards in a single sentence.
Okay.
But you did today relative to the voter ID. And when an overt narco-terrorist state is beating your semi-covert narco-terrorist state in equity at the polls, you're pretty far afield.
Yeah, I would agree with that one. All right, well, listen, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go and get back to doing some news here. Thank you for the phone call. Now, again, let's go on back. Reminder, the head of the IAEA, the UN agency monitoring Iran's compliance with the P5+1 deal, says Iran is fully in compliance. Standing up to Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, who are out there saying, "Well, we've got to invade Iran." They're defying the spirit of the P5+1. Just because they're following all the rules, they have a bad attitude toward us, so forth and so on. Now, one of the pieces of propaganda that came out late last week is an attempt to explain away North Korea's rapid development of nuclear weapons by saying they're getting nuclear weapons technology from Iran and Russia. Now, obviously, if Iran does not have nuclear weapons technology, which the United Nations, IAEA, has certified, then obviously that is nonsense. And as a matter of fact, the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman is saying it's ridiculous. It's not thought out. It's far from reality. And I imagine Russia's probably going to make the same comment as well. Now, over in Lebanon, Israeli jets flew low over the city of Saida in southern Lebanon at supersonic speeds, deliberately creating sonic booms that broke windows and shook buildings, and apparently just drove everybody into a panic in Saida, who thought they were under attack. No comment from the Israeli military just yet, but it does look like Israel's getting ready for another try for that Litani River. Now, not too surprisingly, Prime Minister Saad Hariri is requesting that the Foreign Ministry file a complaint to the United Nations against Israel for planting spy devices and violating Lebanese airspace. And, of course, we know what will happen. Nikki Haley will be out there screaming, veto, 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 veto. Nobody challenges almighty Israel. We'll be back after station identification. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. We're looking at all this flooding in Jacksonville. It's on the corporate media right now. And again, there is an issue. We saw the same thing in Hurricane Sandy, which is that the U.S. government is spending so much money on war that maintenance on our infrastructure is being neglected. The storm drains are not being cleaned out. The branches overhanging the power lines aren't being cut back. And these things magnify the damage from a storm like this. The U.S. government is all about conquering the rest of the world, and they really don't care too much about you, other than that you will pay for it all and breed as many new workers and soldiers as you possibly can. Getting on back over to North Korea, France came on out with this claim that the North Korea military could launch a nuclear missile and hit Europe. Now, Ri Tak-son, who's the deputy director of North Korea's Foreign Ministry's European Department, said France's claim was preposterous and stressed that the North Korean nuclear arsenal is a deterrent against U.S. nuclear threats, and France neither faces a U.S. nuclear threat, nor has France threatened North Korea. Now, John McCain is out there flapping his gums. I think he thinks that having brain cancer is going to buy him a little more slack with the American people. I don't think so. Or maybe this is the tumor speaking on out. But he's out there saying the United States has to step up its presence around North Korea and make clear that aggressive acts would lead to annihilation of the country. Washington needs to make sure that Kim Jong-un knows that if he acts in an aggressive fashion, the price will be extinction. This is what McCain said on CNN's State of the Union. I have a question for John McCain. Does the same hold true for an aggressive United States? Because looking at the history of the last going on 2 decades, it's pretty obvious who the real aggressor in the world is. And it's not North Korea, it's not Iran, it wasn't Iraq, it isn't Syria, it isn't Russia. It is the United States. We're going to take another phone call. Sherry in Texas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Thank you, Mike. This is another Hillary comment. So,
okay.
Now, this is kind of fanciful, I will agree. This is. How Hillary could perhaps, and this is a long shot, perhaps emotionally put aside her losses and feel better and maybe on down the line and make a ton of money. She may have to wait till her husband passes away, but if she clandestinely wrote a book that is totally the truth, and she'd know, and it would have to be absolutely the truth, because if any discrepancies would be found, it would discredit the whole publication. But if she wants to leave anything to Chelsea, and that's including a good reputation, she would, if she's going to be under house arrest someday and just has nothing to do but write, I think that would be a really good idea, because I'd buy it.
Well, I would buy it too, but Hillary would never live long enough to complete it, because, again, that same narcocracy, it always protects itself, even from its own stars. Anybody who goes rogue and says, you know, I'm going to tell you what's really been going on here, bad things will happen to them. And that's up to and including the Clintons themselves. If they turn on that deep state narcocracy, they're toast, and they know it. And in any event, I don't see Hillary having a conscience, come to Jesus moment, if you will. she'll go to her grave maintaining the lies.
Well, I think the more people wake up, the more it might look appealing to her. The only trouble is the clandestineness of it, the under the radar, how she could do this with just maybe a few close confidants in her presence and without anything out there otherwise, and then she'd have to make sure she signs it under notary or something so they'll know it wasn't all created by other people. I mean, it's just doing it without anyone knowing it, like you say, so no one will come in and
it would be difficult.
Off.
I would love to see it. It's not going to happen. It would be difficult. And in any event, Hillary Clinton uses ghostwriters. That's been known ever since going all the way back to It Takes a Village.
Oh, sure.
Hillary's not actually writing her own books. She hires a ghostwriter.
Yeah. Well, it would have to be the truth. I know that. It's a wish I'm going to cling to.
Well,
it's just a wish.
If you want the truth, go to whatreallyhappened.com. Go to Republic Broadcasting Network. We don't need to wait for Hillary to tell us the truth. We don't need to wait for anybody in government to tell us the truth. We already have the truth.
She probably has a few things tucked under her belt, though, that we don't know about that would be, interesting.
Fill in some of the blank spots. Yeah, it would be interesting. But, right now we understand the true nature of the government of the United States of America. It's not a very pleasant reality. And again, we just need to acknowledge it, understand it, have a healthy dose of skepticism for anything this government says. But outside of that, the only real option we have is to just kick on back, disengage, de-link as much as possible from the enforced dependency, and wait for it to consume itself the way the Soviet Union did. Because I'm convinced that's where we're headed. I'm convinced that's where we're going.
I hope so. I'd rather it have do that than let them drag us into war, because that's it's becoming more ridiculous than that they would even consider an option of a third world war at this point. But I think we can do it too. I think we can do it. We might have to get bombed by somebody, though, just because we deserve it. I mean, we've caused so many people so many problems. They may feel like someone's got to stop us. Maybe it'll just be a slap in the face, but I wouldn't blame them if they did. Just one town somewhere, you know.
Again, anybody who attacks the United States invites immediate nuclear retaliation, and that's why it's not happening. It's the same reason that when the Soviet Union fell, people didn't start crossing the border into the new Russian republics because they still had those old Soviet nuclear missiles. And now they've got those trains running again. Anyway, Sherry, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go here. And there we are. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are rejoining the network. Now, as you know, there is a Russian war game getting ready to take place on Russia's side of the border, and it is their right. And supposedly Russia is sending 13,000 troops down there. The propaganda coming out of the West is, it's 100,000 people. It's not really an exercise. They're getting ready to invade. They're coming to get us. It's provocative. Look how Russia's being provocative. And, of course, what they're ignoring is all the NATO troops and weapons that have been pre-positioned along that border with Russia. It is a massive invasion force that is just waiting for a starting time. And so they're out there where you've got the UK Defense Secretary Michael Fallon is saying Russia is only having war games to provoke us. They're just angering us and making us annoyed. No, they're getting ready because they're seeing the continuation of a U.S. policy of invade, drone strike, regime change, invade, drone strike, regime change, invade, drone strike, regime change. Paul Craig Roberts is out there with a very good question. Who is trying so hard to convince Americans that Russia is the enemy? And there has been this ongoing thing about how Russia hacked the DNC emails. We know that was not true. Russia stole the U.S. election for Donald Trump. We know that that's not true. And apparently they're now out there with this claim that Russia has dismantled America's entire democracy for the bargain basement price of $100,000. Which was used to purchase some ads on Facebook. And so everybody's starting to realize just how silly this entire Russian collusion narrative has become. So Paul Craig Roberts is out there. He's got an article, Laughing on the Way to Armageddon, and says the U.S. government is showing the world such a ridiculous face that the world would be laughing at us if they weren't afraid of our weapons. Russia is not our enemy. Our own government is our enemy. We're going to take a phone call. Terry in Oregon, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, it was 16 years ago. I was captain of a Boeing 747 that took off from Tokyo on my way to Chicago. And, of course, we didn't make it. We went to Edmonton, Alberta, and stayed there 3 days and took off and recovered it back in the U.S. after that. But the Canadians really stepped up for us. You know, I really appreciate that. So we got to the hotel, went down to the bar, and I'm watching the video, and it showed this airplane bleeding into the building. And we all knew that that was impossible. So, but, you know, looking at over the years, my big question was, what happened to the passengers and what happened to the crew of those airplanes that sat on the side of that building? And I was listening to STC report with Sean this morning.
Hang on. Let me ask you a simple question, okay? If you're going to go to the trouble to have all these airplanes under remote control, okay, why not fly them into the targets? Because it's much simpler that way. You don't have to have a substitute. You don't have to get rid of the passengers or the flight crew or anybody. I mean, every time somebody comes up with this nonsense about how there was no plane at the Pentagon, the first thing I say is, you know, if they've gone to all this trouble to get that airplane close enough to the Pentagon for everybody to see it flying in, why not just let it go on in? It's simpler. Why take the chance at being exposed with another layer of deception? Most of these deceptions, they try and keep them as simple as possible. Even though they still make mistakes, you know, like Flight 93. Anyway, thanks an awful lot for the phone call. We're going to let you go here. Getting on back to the war zones here, the U.S., let's be honest, let's be objective, let's be fair. The U.S. has lost in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is going to remain in control of that country. The Syrian people are going to remain in control of their country. And so the U.S. war planners have a problem, how not to have this major setback derail the grand plan of conquering all the world's resource-rich areas and shackle them to the U.S. dollar. The fact that Syria has, for all intents and purposes, escaped is setting a bad example. Other countries are going to say, we don't have to be slaves to the dollar anymore. Syria was able to do it. They withstood the U.S. attack with the help of Russia. And that's another reason why the U.S. government is trying to bash Russia. That gosh darn Russia, they just got in the way of our conquering the entire world and making them all slaves to the U.S. dollar. How dare they do that? So we're probably going to see an escalation of conflict in other parts of the world, if for no other reason than to distract us all from the fact that the United States government has suffered a major defeat in Syria. Now, this ties in with the economic news. And apparently, there are rumblings that the world may turn away from the dollar this coming January. And apparently, the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund have both confirmed a plan to replace the U.S. dollar. The United Nations is saying we need a new global reserve system, which I disagree with. We don't need another private central bank because we'll still have the same problems of private central banking. But the UN is saying we need a system that no longer relies on the United States dollars as the single major reserve currency. The IMF says they want to make the special drawing right the principal reserve asset in the International Monetary Fund. So whatever's going to happen is going to happen before the end of the year. Because if the UN and the IMF move forward with these plans, that's it. That's the final nail in the coffin of the U.S. Federal Reserve note. There is nothing else to prop the economy up than foreign demand of U.S. dollars. Last week we had a story saying the reason wages and salaries are stagnant is because our entire economy is now all about financialization. We're going to loan people our instantly created out of thin air money, and we will get wealth that way. A desperate attempt to go back to Bretton Woods, and the world recognizes what's happening, and they're not going along with that. Even China is out there saying, we need a new global reserve currency. We can't be dependent on the dollar anymore. And it makes perfect sense. I'm sure we're going to hear that all these countries hate America for our freedoms and our wealth and so forth and so on. But the bottom line is the dollar has become untrustworthy. It could implode literally at any moment, and nobody wants to have any significant part of their assets denominated in those U.S. dollars. Now, here's an interesting story that came out of Sputnik News. Russia can convert electricity into cryptocurrencies. And this is coming out from Alexander Borodich, the founder of the Universa Block platform and a venture investor. And in an interview on Radio Sputnik, he said that being a country rich in natural resources, Russia is able to convert electricity into cryptocurrencies through mining, thus generating as much cryptocurrencies as possible to trade with on the market. Now, I have a vague recollection that I've seen this idea somewhere before, called the Electro. It's buzzing around in the back of my head. I know I've heard this idea somewhere. Maybe more people are reading this website than I've been thinking about. Okay, let's see. Let's erase that. Now, the Kaiser report is out there saying something that we have been saying repeatedly on this show. Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi were killed for attempting to pull away from the petrodollar. Remember, in just about 1 year before George Bush started screaming about Saddam's nuclear weapons, Saddam got permission from the United Nations to sell Iraq's oil for the euro. And Tony Blair flew to the United States, to Texas, had a meeting with President Bush. 1 year later, we're invading Iraq. We lynched Saddam Hussein, and Iraq's oil is back on the world market, only for the U.S. dollar. Down in Libya, where everybody was admiring what Gaddafi was doing for Libya, greening it up, massive engineering works, aquifer projects across the whole country, and then he gets rid of the private central bank, establishes a state bank and a new value-based currency, the gold dinar. And then Gaddafi announced that the oil in Libya would be available for sale only for the gold dinar. Oh, go on in, color revolution, kill Gaddafi, shut down the state bank, impose a private central bank. Nobody knows where the gold for the gold dinar actually wound up. And Libya's oil is on the market for the U.S. dollar. That's what's driving all of this. The U.S. government is desperate to keep the rest of the world enslaved to the U.S. dollar. Because without that, our economy is doomed. We don't have any manufacturing. Look at our trade imbalance. $1.5 billion, $2 billion every single day. And nobody wants our GMO agriculture. This country has nothing else left propping up its economy other than forcing other countries to borrow U.S. dollars at interest to conduct their business. And these other countries are turning away. And if they all turn away at the same time, next January, that will be it. Because the U.S. cannot declare war on the rest of the planet all at the same time and expect to win. Even Venezuela is now talking about ditching the dollar and switching over to the yuan. People don't like dealing with the dollar because the dollar has been weaponized in the geopolitical sense. If you're dependent on the dollar, well, then we get to come on in and tell you how you're going to run your business in your country. And people are not happy with that at all. So let's see. Irma's been downgraded now back to a tropical storm. The winds are still near hurricane force. And I actually got an email the other day chastising me about all this Cat 1, Cat 2 because it was a disservice. The winds are bad. Even as a tropical storm, the winds are bad. You got to take care of yourself. And there have, unfortunately, already been a lot of deaths, massive property damage. We don't even know if the United States can afford to rebuild Florida, especially if Jose comes across there. We'll be back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. So let's talk a little bit about the immigration problem over in Europe. That's not gone away. I know we're all focused on the storms here, and right now they're saying it's going to take weeks to restore power to everyone. My understanding is half of Florida is without electricity right now. And the storm is going to be churning up there into Appalachia and eventually as far north as Indiana. But these other problems are still out there. North Korea, the economy, and the rest of it. We have to keep a focus on this. Poland is refusing to take its EU immigrant quota. And Germany is threatening to fine Poland $75 million for failing to live up to the immigration quota. Poland has responded by demanding $1 trillion in World War II reparations from Germany. And this is, as a foreign policy, it's kind of, shall we say, chaotic. But we're seeing more and more indications of an attempt to still, at this late date, derail the Brexit. To heck with what the people want. The power players want the one world government. We can't let Brexit go. We can't let anywhere go. But I have to tell you very honestly, I think in a major economic upheaval, the EU is going to break apart. And I think the EU is being torn apart by the refugee crisis because somebody did not think it all the way through. They were just sitting there in their little smoke-filled rooms and saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to start flooding Europe and the United States with all these refugees from other countries and blur them all together so that they lose their own sense of identity, and that way they'll be easy to control. Not realizing the reality of things like culture shock and xenophobia, and the fact that those who were most likely to make that migratory trip were going to be from the lower levels of the source society, leading to the epidemic of sexual abuse cases. And then there's the issue of the contagious diseases that are being brought into parts of the world where they had formerly been eradicated. And it's created a huge amount of hostility with the indigenous traditional population. All right, we're going to take a phone call here. Anthony in California. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to make a comment about the corporations.
Sure.
First of all, what do you think of the announcer or this person? He's known. I heard him on Coast to Coast with George Norrie.
Mm-hmm.
His name's Craig B. Hewlett. Have you heard of him?
No.
Okay, well, he's had. I heard him on Coast to Coast, and he gave me he gave a little insight for me and for others on the talk show about the corporations in America that is part of an oligarchy, and that it doesn't matter who's in office, whether it's Trump or his predecessors that go way back to John F. And he says that the reason why we're all over the world is because of these corporations and this oligarchy, and that they control the presidency, basically. What do you think?
Well, yeah, there's definitely merit in that. Every election cycle, you will see these large corporations, especially the financial corporations, pharmaceuticals, defense contractors, will donate to both candidates on either side of the contest. So regardless of what the people vote for, these corporations now have a lever on whoever is sitting in that office. And by this very simple device, the corporations are able to bypass the will of the voters. Now, there was a time in this country when we had laws that restricted campaign donation to try and make the campaign donation reflective of the popular support of a candidate. And then we had that ridiculous Citizens United decision that basically declared corporations to be people for the purposes of removing any restrictions on how much money they could spend on politicians. And it turned Washington, D.C. into a giant one-stop shopping center for all the corrupting influences in our country. And these corporations have got so much money, it really is impossible for the American people to begin to match them. Because the politicians will take your votes, but after they win their office, their first allegiance, their first loyalty is going to be to whoever paid the bills to get them there. And that really is what has turned us into a fascist economic dictatorship. Anthony, got to let you go. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, along with Poland, Hungary and Slovakia have lashed out at this claim by Brussels that these member nations of the European Union have to accept these mandatory migrant quotas. And as I said before, this could very easily become the mechanism by which the European Union is shattered. Because from the point of view of people living in these member countries, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Sweden, Germany, this migrant issue is all downside and no upside. It's been nothing but expense and difficulty. Apparently there were some brawls in Berlin involving these migrants who were lured to Europe with promises of all kinds of free stuff, and now they're in Europe, they're not getting the free stuff, and they're acting out. They're basically acting out. Boy, somebody's really trying to attack my server right now. The spoiled little children must have their fun. All right, well, we'll let them roll around on the floor and kick and scream for a little while longer. Now, interestingly enough, down in Australia, it looks like they've had enough of this as well. Australia's Supreme Court has now approved the forced removal of asylum seekers to Sri Lanka, despite claims that they face appalling conditions of imprisonment, including torture, maltreatment, and violence. Here's the missing part. What did these people do in Sri Lanka that they faced imprisonment? Are they criminals? Are they rapists? Are they burglars? Are they robbers? Asylum doesn't mean a get-out-of-jail-free card for crimes you committed in some other part of the world. Now, a former immigration official is out there saying that up to 50% of these DACA recipients are in fact fraudulent. Huge amounts of fraud in all of this program. It's amazing. Now then, story out of foodbabe.com. Do you trust Snopes? You won't after reading this. And the article basically goes on into the fact that Snopes founders apparently are people of questionable character. They're in the middle of a messy divorce. Apparently, the owner of Snopes embezzled money from Snopes.com for a wild lifestyle. Apparently, one of the people working on Snopes is a former sex worker herself. But the big issue is right now half of Snopes is owned by a public relations firm. And they are subject to lobbying by Monsanto, Bayer, Dow, Syngenta, DuPont. And a lot of people have started to really look at Snopes and say that on certain key issues, they are not in fact trustworthy. Certainly on the issues of 9/11 and Vince Foster, they toe the official U.S. government line. They set themselves up as an authoritative figure, will tell you what's real or not on the internet, and they're just there to reinforce the same lies. You have got to stop relying on other people to figure this stuff out for you. You have to learn to develop your own analytical sense and figure out for yourself what seems like it's true, what appears to be false. Now, we've talked before about the intelligence agency's involvement in Hollywood, and I felt their wrath back in 1994. But it is, there's Operation Mockingbird, the FBI was in there, J. Edgar Hoover just had a thing for Hollywood and knowing what they were going to do and making sure that they never portrayed the FBI in a negative light. The Pentagon has an entertainment liaison office. They've had it since 1948. Coming out of World War II, and of course Hollywood had done yeoman's work doing propaganda films to support the war effort. So the Pentagon has an entertainment liaison office since 1948. The CIA has a similar office starting in 1996. And yes, they will request script changes in exchange for advice, permission to use locations, and the use of equipment like aircraft carriers. Now, files obtained through the Freedom of Information Act show that between 1911 and 2017, more than 800 feature films received support from the U.S. government's Department of Defense. This is far higher than people were aware of, and included franchises like Transformers, Iron Man, The Terminator. Over on TV, there were 1,100 titles that received Pentagon backing, 900 of them since 2005, from Flight 93, which we knew they were going to support that one, to Ice Road Truckers, to Army Wives. So that may be why Hollywood is looking at their worst box office, summer box office, in something like 25 years. Because if movies and TV are turned into just another corporate media outlet pushing the propaganda, people aren't going to pay money to buy a ticket, sit in a theater, and watch the same stuff they're getting hurled at them from the TV news day after day. They want to see something different. A lot of people are wondering just how American-made, how accurate it's going to be about the CIA's involvement in that Iran-Contra cocaine running. But I think if Hollywood really wants to start making some money, they might want to think about moving away from being a propaganda arm of the U.S. government, which is what J. Edgar Hoover wanted, and actually start doing movies that tell the truth about recent events. And I'm getting indications that there are some parts of Hollywood who are thinking that has to be their future, because they're not going to make it the way things are right now. Now, getting on over to the area of political correctness, apparently the National Science Foundation spent $138,000 interrogating 4-year-olds about their gender identity. Now, when you're 4 years old, you only have a vague idea of the idea of boy versus girl. Are they really interrogating them or indoctrinating them to this idea of gender fluidity, that your gender is completely disconnected from your physicality? And again, that's part of that globalist New World Order agenda to get us just as confused as possible about who we are, where we come from, what our history is. They're trying to blur our cultural identity. They're tearing down all the Confederate statues. Now they're talking about even the American flag is coming under attack. They want us so confused we don't even know which restroom we're supposed to use. It's amazing here. All right, let's talk a little bit about computers. Any unpatched Android phone running a version older than Oreo, I love the way they name their updates, you're going to need patching fairly soon. Researchers have turned up a class of vulnerability that lets malware draw fake dialogues so users okay their own download of malware to get it past the security. Now, a security researcher has discovered not one or two, but a total of 10 critical zero-day vulnerabilities in routers from Taiwan-based networking equipment manufacturer D-Link, which leave users open to cyber attacks. The D-Link DIR-850L wireless AC1200 dual-band gigabit cloud routers are vulnerable to 10 security issues, including several trivial cross-site scripting flaws, lack of proper firmware protection, backdoor access, and command injection attacks resulting in root access. If successfully exploited, these vulnerabilities could allow hackers to intercept connection, upload malicious firmware, and gain root privileges, enabling them to remotely hijack and control affected routers, as well as the network, leaving all connected devices vulnerable to cyber attacks as well. Now, is this something that D-Link just decided to do on their own, or is this another example of the NSA trying to backdoor all of our electronics so that they can access our information whenever they feel like, and in the meantime leave us wide open to cyber attack? I mean, look at all these massive data breaches we've been seeing. Equifax, for example. How many of these data breaches are accomplished using exploits the NSA designed into our systems? Far from making our IT infrastructure more secure, the NSA and the CIA have just made it vulnerable and wide open. And apparently in their mind, their ability to spy on us, in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment, I might add, trumps any concern for the safety and security of our business records, our financial records, and our personal information. As long as they can watch us, that's all that they really think about. And by the way, more and more of these data dumps from CIA are coming on out. Just these incredible tools created at taxpayer expense to attack your computer and make you vulnerable. All right, we're going to take a phone call. Tony in Puerto Rico, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. I just want to make a quick comment and change the subject a little bit. Listen, Mike, if the Ottoman Empire during World War I would have backed the winning side, would they still be around today?
Boy, that is a really hard one to say, and I'm going to go with no, they probably wouldn't. Because they were considerably powerful going into World War I, and coming out of World War I, we would have seen the great powers love nothing better than to break up other great powers. That's what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East. They're starting to carve up Iraq, Turkey, and Syria for the new Kurdistan. They want to take a few very large, powerful nations and turn them into 30 or 40 little tiny nations that are easy to bully and push around.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
All right, thanks an awful lot. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Let's get some phone calls in here. Now, the World Health Organization has declared a new Ebola epidemic in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They confirmed 9 cases linked to the virus in this remote forested region. 3 people have reportedly died, causing alarm among health officials who fear this could be another outbreak similar to the 2014 epidemic, which killed about 11,000 people. Now, Ebola comes in various strains, of which Ebola Mayinga is the most serious. That's like a 90% lethality rate. Interestingly enough, there is a strain called Ebola Reston that surfaced in a Reston, Virginia animal quarantine facility, and everybody got really panicked. Ebola was here in the U.S. As it turned out, that strain only affected monkeys. Humans were totally immune to it. Now, the problem with any of these Ebola viruses, they're based on a strand of RNA, not DNA. And RNA is like unwinding a DNA strand and taking just one half of it and folding it back on itself. So you have this loop, and it's not always a good fit. You'll have these gaps and loops, and they can change very rapidly, and that is really what makes RNA-based viruses dangerous. They mutate very rapidly, and they're very, very unstable. And the research that's been done on them indicate that newly emergent RNA viruses are even more unstable. They can change as much as 10% of their genome in a single generation. So a lot of people have wondered, where did Ebola come from? Is it somebody's idea of a bioweapon and it's being tested and refined? Because if you look at the Ebola outbreaks in Africa, they're in very geographically distant areas where you don't look at a means of transmission from point A to point B. Now, there's a wonderful book called The Hot Zone, which is all about Ebola and the attempt to find a source and identify where this actually came from, or even what the carrier is. But it is nasty, nasty, nasty. Now, again, Tom Clancy, in his book Rainbow Six, had this storyline of the world's billionaires wanting Earth all for themselves, and so they took an engineered Ebola, and they were going to spray it all over all of us, and we were all going to die horribly, and they would have Earth and their palaces and nature all to themselves here. Now, we've been talking about all this stink face being made at Russia, the Russia bashing, hostilities. And it's kind of weird where we're seeing these repeat instances where the U.S. government is provoking nations with which we are actually dependent. And a good example of that would be China, where we're down there in the South China Sea, encroaching on their islands. We're trying to lay the blame for North Korea on China, which China refuses to accept. And now they're talking about sanctions on China itself. If that happens, our stores are going to empty on out. That $1.5 billion a day trade imbalance mostly involves China. All the things that you have in your home, the little appliances and everything, most of those are coming from China. If there are sanctions on China, or if China just decides to stop exporting things to our country, those stores are going to empty on out. So you have, on one hand, you're angering China in the South China Sea, threatening sanctions on them. At the same time, you're asking them to make nice and help with North Korea. Now, there's another area where this is going on, and this has to do with Russian rocket engines. The U.S. is still dependent on having to buy rocket engines from Russia. And apparently the U.S. government spent billions of dollars on defense contractors to produce an American-made replacement. They weren't able to do it. We've actually forgotten how to make good rocket engines in all those years since Apollo. And so you have making all this stink face at Russia, saying Russia's arming North Korea with nukes. At the same time, we're having to buy rocket engines from them, as well as hitch a ride on their rockets to get our astronauts up to the International Space Station. It doesn't really seem a consistent foreign policy, does it? We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and we're keeping an eye here on the flooding that's going on. Apparently, the police in Jacksonville, Florida, have issued a statement. Apparently, people are trapped in their homes by the flooding. And apparently, they've put out this little statement. If you need to get out and you can't, then you just tie a white sheet to the front of your house so that we know that you're in there, and they'll try and get to you. So it's really kind of a mess out there. Backing up to the war zones here, as you know, Trump is talking about sending arms to Ukraine, including offensive weapons to use against those pesky Eastern Ukrainian republics who don't want to be part of the European Union. And apparently Putin has now sent a reply saying that if the U.S. arms Ukraine, Russia will arm the Taliban. And again, the Russians have got to be laughing their heads off that the U.S. walked into Afghanistan, which is known historically as the graveyard of empires. The British found that out the hard way. The Soviet Union found that out the hard way. And the U.S. is finding it out the hard way. In fact, during his little speech on the 9/11 commemoration this morning, Trump was actually out there saying that, yes, the Taliban is now in more control of more of Afghanistan than they were, right after we invaded. So they're losing there. And of course, you're hearing about the surge. They're going to send all these troops into Afghanistan. If Russia starts arming the Taliban, it is going to be a bloodbath for those American personnel. But we have these two great powers are sparring off against each other. And again, the U.S. does not have the moral high ground in any of this. And you need to go back to Sun Tzu and the Art of War. And it says right there in the very beginning of that book, and that, by the way, it's required reading in most military schools. It says, two of the things that a ruler who wishes to prevail in war must have is a military that believes in the moral rightness of the war, so that they will fight fiercely and, if necessary, die in that war. And you must have a civilian population that believes in the moral rightness of the war, so that they will bear the suffering and hardships that war brings even to the victorious side. And the U.S. government has neither one of those. So we're on this path to this incredibly destructive World War III. And again, I'm pretty convinced that future history books are going to say, we were in World War III at this point. They may even go all the way back and say 9/11 started it all. That was the Big Bang that started World War III. Apparently, YouTube is trending a video of Hillary Clinton talking about her new book. It has over 8,000 dislikes. People just don't like Hillary Clinton. And that's a big reason why she lost, along with an awareness of her history. It wasn't white people. It wasn't sexism. It wasn't the media or the independent media. We just don't like Hillary Clinton. We'll be back after station identification. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Hour number 3. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Let's get some calls going here. Apparently, over at the United Nations, they tried to pass the original set of sanctions that the U.S. wanted, and it didn't go anywhere. So now they're back with what is being described as a watered-down set of sanctions to try and get that through. And personally, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen because, again, the issue really at heart is, does North Korea or any other nation have a right to establish a deterrent to prevent their country from being invaded? And, of course, the answer is going to be yes, of course. It's just common sense. So they're going to be voting late tonight on a new watered-down sanction resolution. And apparently this new version has dropped the U.S. demands to ban all oil imports to the country and freeze the international assets of the government and its leader, Kim Jong-un. Now, of course, the other issues are this claim that any member nation of the UN will have a right to stop a North Korean ship in international waters and inspect it to make sure that they're not smuggling marshmallows or whatever it is that they're concerned about. Again, there was a call for a partial naval blockade of North Korea. Both of these are considered, well, the blockade is an act of war under international law, and boarding somebody's ship in international waters without their permission is an act of piracy, again, under international law. So the U.S. is out there wanting to commit what are basically illegal acts and somehow convince you that this is all right and just. And it really isn't. It really, really is not at all. So we'll see what happens with these sanctions. But at this point, again, the issue is looking at the United States history over the last 20 years of constant invasion, regime change, drone strike, use of torture, war crimes. North Korea isn't the problem. North Korea has every right. Remembering how badly they suffered at the start of the Korean War at the hands of the United States, they have every right to want to find a way to keep the United States from coming back in. I mean, I'd do that if I were running North Korea, wouldn't you? Because you look at those countries that went along with U.S. demands, like Iraq or Syria. Iraq surrendered their weapons of mass destruction. So did Syria. They still got invaded. There's an object lesson there. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what concession you make. Once you are in the crosshairs of the United States government, they are going to get you. All right, we're going to take a phone call. Joel in Wisconsin. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
considering all the lies that the government media complex has told us about 911, and considering your intelligence and your background in computer animation, my question is, how can you look at the footage of the airplanes entering the buildings and not see that it's fake?
It's not fake. Okay, and that's coming from my long years of background in computer animation. And by the way, you're forgetting about, you know, a few 100,000 people on the ground who saw those planes hit the buildings. I mean, kind of little common sense.
No, here's common sense. You're assuming that there was planes. Then you're assuming that people saw them. But if there were no planes, then nobody saw them.
You look at the Nodé brothers documentary. In fact, look at any documentary, you know, that's happening on the street there, where the people are saying, "We saw the planes hit. We saw the plane hits." All right, thank you very much. We're going to let you go. This is part of the kookification campaign. They're still trying to protect the official story by trying to kookify anybody who's got a different point of view. Same thing with that no plane at the Pentagon nonsense that they've been putting on out there almost since day one. And every time corporate media attacks the 9/11 truth movement, that's the first thing they pull on out. Oh, these people don't even believe that a plane hit the Pentagon. No, it's the plants, the shills, the paid trolls who are out there pushing that nonsense. At the same time, they're claiming the Apollo moon landings were faked and that HAARP is changing the weather and chemtrails are real and Elvis is off in a flying saucer somewhere. It's called poisoning the well. It's a classic propaganda technique, and that's what they're trying to do. But again, when you come on out and say, oh, these footage all have to be fake, okay, how do you explain all the eyewitnesses? I mean, Claire and I were in New York for the 10th anniversary of 9/11. We took part in a symposium there, and of course, we just met thousands of people who had actually seen the attacks on the World Trade Center, saw the plane go in. And so you can't claim that this was all faked, you know, unless you're willing to say the entire city of New York was somehow bribed to go along with this hoax. It just really doesn't make any sense. Occam's razors at work here. And again, because of my long years in visual effects, the footage is real. With the exception of the one showing a cruise missile hitting the Pentagon, that was a pretty sloppy fake. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And let me just get this thing done here. Now then, for quite a while, NASA has been talking about what is called the M drive. This is supposedly a fuel-free drive that could take humans to Mars in just 10 weeks. Now, it's been theorized for years by NASA, but the space agency has been unable to create a working demonstrator. Now, apparently, word is coming out of China, they've succeeded where NASA failed, that they've created a working prototype of the impossible fuel-free engine. And that would be a major breakthrough because it would really open up the rest of the solar system. If you're talking about weeks to get to the outer planets instead of years, it's a whole different ball game. And then all of a sudden you can start talking about commercialization of space, mining the asteroids. Because there's a lot of raw material out there that if it could be brought down to Earth in some safe landing spot, could be put to commercial use. Probably find a lot of rare earth minerals out there. A lot of fresh water out there. And of course, space tourism. I mean, right now, space tourism is basically you go up, you're weightless for a few minutes, you come back down. That's it. And it only costs you a few $100,000. We're talking like real space tourism. You know, going to the moon for your anniversary. Going on out and seeing Saturn. That would be an amazing thing to see here. Now, so far, boy, September has been a rough month, hasn't it? Fires all over the western half of the United States. Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Jose, which now appears still aimed at the east coast of the United States. Hurricane, Kiria, which, by the way, has now skipped over Mexico, is in the Pacific and looks to be strengthening, possibly heading our way as well. Then you have these monster solar flares. There's a major solar storm going on. And we're getting these huge flares, which X-class flares that are just interfering with high-frequency radio, power failures. Boy, it's like somebody up there really doesn't like us at all. And finally, on top of that, this is an area of some major, major concern. As you know, a lot of people are looking at Yellowstone and the fact that it is a caldera from an ancient supervolcano eruption. And if you study the geology from Yellowstone Lake extending to the southwest, you will see the remains of several earlier eruptions. They're spaced out on a regular period, and not that it really is that crucial. We're actually a little overdue for a new eruption. But everybody's got all their attention focused on Yellowstone Lake and the assumption that the next eruption will happen in Yellowstone. Maybe, maybe not. Because since September 2nd, in the Soda Springs area of Idaho, there have been over 250 earthquakes, and many have been over magnitude 4. Now, the reality is that magma pool underneath that part of the country, nobody really knows exactly how deep it is or how wide it is, or whether there might have other branches. Now, volcanoes do not just appear with that cone shape immediately. They begin with a simple hole in the ground. And so a lot of people are starting to wonder if maybe they shouldn't be sending the U.S. Geological Service down to Soda Springs with a bunch of tilt meters. Because it is entirely possible that that giant Yellowstone magma chamber is underneath Soda Springs as well. And it may be looking for a vent there. Because when it starts to build up the pressure, it's going to break through wherever the terrain above it is weakest. And the problem with bursting through an earlier caldera is that remnants of the dried lava has the consistency of poured concrete. And so if there's a side vent able to open up, and side vents are a common feature on volcanoes. We have them down on the Big Island, where you've got Kilauea Crater is a side vent. Down along Chain of Craters Road, those are all side vents where it's just easier for the lava to come on out there. All right, we're going to take a phone call from Charlie in Los Angeles. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Charlie, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, you're on the air. What's on your mind?
Oh, what's on my mind is I was wondering, how did Larry Silverstein, you know, he collected insurance on the building and all those dead people over the years. Nobody ever took a shot at him. I mean, look at, he collected insurance, he built a new tower, he's walking around New York City, but all those dead firemen and their relatives, you know, hell, he's just, you know, flying back and forth across the country. I mean, you would think somebody would want to kill him. You can't collect insurance on a building where 3,500 people die and not expect anybody to try to kill you.
Well,
it probably would have killed them. I say there wasn't anybody in the buildings. That's what I'm saying.
Well, no, there were people in the building. They found the human remains. They identified them with DNA. The situation is, first of all, Larry Silverstein, I'm sure, has the very best security that money can buy, and he did make out fairly well from the insurance, although the courts did rule against him. He had taken out anti-terrorism insurance on the World Trade Center, and he tried to claim that each of the two towers represented a separate terror attack, and hence could be paid for by the full benefit. The court said no, it was a single terror attack, so he didn't get as much money.
All right. Okay, I understand the details, Mike. I understand the details, but the fire department has the keys for every building, and you would think that somebody would have squeaked in there and knocked him off, especially with all those dead firemen. I just don't believe it. The human nature is not involved in this terrorist attack. I never saw one deer.
Okay, Charlie, there's no question that Larry Silverstein took economic advantage of 9/11, but that's a long way away from saying that he was personally to blame for it, which is, I think, the place you would have to get to before you would wish him harm. I think you'd be better off wondering, why didn't the United States, after catching these Israelis singing and dancing and cheering and clapping as the towers came on down, why didn't they keep them in prison in the United States? Why did they send them back to Israel? And why is the footage that they shot on their camera still classified? And the obvious answer there is they captured
the most important footage is the footage that's not there, and that's people escaping the buildings at the time of the attack. There's no video of people running out of the building.
Sure there is. Sure there is.
Oh, no, there's not.
Look at the
Look at the running out of those towers.
Okay, we've got ourselves another one of these shills that are trying to say, oh, it's all fake, it's all kooky. Look at the Nodé Brothers documentary on 9/11, and you will see people fleeing the buildings. They actually got into the lobby of one of the World Trade Towers and showed people evacuating. Obviously, the government is very concerned that people are not buying that official story any longer. And I've seen polls, obviously our poll is going to be, it's our audience, and people don't believe what the government says. But I've seen polls just across America where most Americans don't believe the official story of 9/11. And hiring people to come on in and say, oh, it was all fake, it was all computer animation, there were no people in the building. They're trying to kookify the discussion. And that's how scared they are. They've lost the ability to lie to the public with impunity. And they don't know what to do about it. Because lying is what they do. It's what they've done all along. They don't know any other way to run a country other than by lying to the people. And they're stuck. And if there's one thing that we can point to as a victory for the independent media, it's that we've taken away the government and the corporate media's ability to lie to the public with impunity. Americans are becoming very skeptical of the official story about anything, and that is a healthy thing because the skeptical people are a free people. All right, we're going to take another phone call. Keith in Montana, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Yeah, in reference to what you were just saying, I've seen the videos of the people running out of there with all burnt and stuff from that explosion down the elevators and stuff. But anyway, I was going to talk to you today. If you pan out on that USGS map there, or even go to Google Maps, you'll see that Soda Springs isn't too far from the craters of the moon where the old lava flows are along U.S. Highway 93 that runs south for miles and miles from the other, whenever that one there went off.
Yeah, but, that's one of the prior Yellowstone eruptions, and it was sort of assumed that the core of the magma zone is continuing to track to the northeast because of tectonic forces. But again, that doesn't rule out the possibility of a side vent. But something is definitely applying pressure to that terrain underneath.
Yeah, and if you look at Google Earth there and you look at it, it looks like a bunch of laid down, what we call shale rock over here, that has been laid down at its angle there, that mountain range.
Yes.
And so, yes, these recent quakes, this, what was it, a 4.3 earlier today, they're all in the same area of that magnitude 5.3, but they're shallow quakes. Some are as low as 3 miles or 3 kilometers. So one would think that maybe something is cracking there to relieve pressure from Yellowstone itself.
Yeah, that's the only thing that really makes sense, because the only thing that's under there that's going to be putting pressure on the surface is that magma chamber. And again, they've managed to map part of it out, but that thing could reach all the way over to the west coast and the Cascadia region.
Yeah, they said it goes as far as Kennewick in one map there, but from outside of Wyoming clear over to Kennewick there. But because we all, like right where my house is here in Montana, we have like Quinn Springs, Hot Springs, and they're all thermal areas.
Yes.
So we're probably all sitting on top of it. But I do think, though, that if something happens, it is this one little mountain range there, and it is a mountain range. So that I think if it did something, and it's not a really heavily populated area around the mountains itself, which is good. So if something did kind of erupt there or something, or spill out, it would relieve pressure and probably stop the big one from going off, you know?
Well, that all depends on how much gas the magma is saturated with. Because supervolcanoes, you tend to have a lava which is a lot like bottled soda pop, in which there's a lot of gases dissolved in the liquid, and when you take the pressure off, it expands explosively. And that's the difference between your basic smooth-running volcano like we have here on the Big Island and a supervolcano. It's mostly propelled by the gas, and I think if we can assume that the prior eruptions from that magma chamber were highly explosive, that any new eruption breaking through to the surface is likely to be the same. So obviously...
Right, and if
go ahead.
I was just going to say, Mike, if you draw a line from Lincoln, Montana, where we had our latest big earthquake here, down to there, you'll see it's almost a straight line through Yellowstone, okay?
Okay, Keith, I'm going to put you on hold. I'm going to bring you back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. And we're just now getting word. Apparently, the UN Security Council unanimously approved the watered-down resolution on North Korea. So we'll have to take a look at exactly what was in there. But apparently, it was something that both Russia and China felt they could live with. Let's get on back to Keith in Montana. We're talking about this swarm of quakes in Idaho that have a lot of people worried if, in point of fact, there might be a new volcano forming there. Because, again, it's just going to start as a hole in the ground. There'll be a hole in the ground, and all of a sudden lava and other stuff will come out of it.
Yeah, the other issue, though, if you remember last year, though, it was just a few miles over next to that Craters of the Moon that we had the Chalice, Idaho swarm.
Yes.
And I had talked to a geologist about that, and I asked him what he thought, and he told me just read Revelations 9. But anyway, what's interesting now is, I think I misstated that earlier, it was a 4.6 earlier this morning, and then a 4.1, and these are shallower quakes. And, you know, it'd be different if they were really far down like that, but it does look like something is cracking rock trying to break itself through the surface.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I don't know the hydrology of the region, but it does look like there's some uplifting. And again, the smart thing to do would be putting tilt meters, which actually I don't even think they need to do that anymore. They can actually do the interferometry from space-based radar and see if the ground is actually...
is that what they do? Can they see if it's hot from that way, Mike?
They can see how hot it is with infrared, but I'm talking about if you're actually seeing a deformation of the surface of the ground, that they can actually map that now with space-based radar.
Oh, okay, awesome. All right, well, I'll let you go there, but because you got another break coming up here really fast. But anyway, I did want to say this. Twitter is loaded up with people tweeting their representatives about this. You know, we'd like to thank everyone for all the loss of 9/11. Like the people are actually, you can see on the replies and stuff, and actually their comments, they don't believe this, and I think that's why this shill stuff is coming out.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. They're just trying to keep the lid.
All
right, thanks an awful lot. Yeah, they're just going through the motions. They're going through the motions. You know, our job is to preserve the official history of what's going on, no matter how ridiculous it may sound. All right, another phone call. Alan in Chicago. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. When you're mentioning the two brothers, are you speaking of the two French brothers that were in New York filming along with the fire department?
Yes.
I have a copy of that on VHS. I can't remember exactly, but it was a full documentary. And I'm going to tell you, you're 100% right, Mike. They started the documentary in the morning. They caught the first plane at low level flying into the tower. Totally, you could hear it. It was just mind-blowingly loud. Then later on at the day, I believe the two brothers got separated, and one brother was in one of the towers, literally, with the fire department, and you could hear it sounded like missiles coming down, and they said, "What is that?" And they said, "Those are people jumping."
Yes.
And they were hitting the glass atrium. And then they were in when the thing started to go down, and the guy, I mean, it's heart-wrenching. He actually made it out of the tower, and it was just rumbling. And the
yeah,
fire
he
department
was inside. He was inside when the first tower collapsed, and it just, you know, the debris piled up and around all the windows, and they went into blackout. It's a wonderful documentary, and of course, these two gentlemen did not set out to do a documentary about the destruction of the World Trade Towers. It started out as a documentary about becoming a New York City Fire Department firefighter. And they just found this one student coming out of the academy, and they said, we're just going to follow you around and show what it's like to be a novice firefighter. And they just happened to be there when 9/11 happened. And at that point, they had a whole new documentary. I have it on DVD. It is an absolute wonderful documentary, and everybody needs to look at it, because there are a lot of things that were captured in this documentary where you have even the firefighters saying, gee, the way that building came down, it just, you know, boom, 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 like a controlled demolition. The firefighters are actually saying that in the documentary. And of course, there is that other revelation where they're being told there is a third plane on its way to New York, which we presume was Flight 93 that was supposed to crash into building number 7, but for whatever reason, Flight 93 was brought back under the control of the crew, and at that point they had to shoot it down. Alan, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Checking back in on these storms, Irma's center, where the eye used to be, it's back down to a tropical storm here. It's up into Georgia, heading northwest across Alabama, should be in Tennessee middle of the week. Then it's going predicted to basically move northeast into Indiana. And apparently the storm surge is reaching all the way up to North Carolina and all the way out for the entire Florida panhandle. They're saying it can be 6 feet high. The Miami, Orlando, and Tampa airports are still closed, and they're just trying to recover from that whole mess. Now, Tropical Storm Jose, as I mentioned earlier, I just checked the track on that one again. And it sort of got out of this wandering around, aimless, can't make up its mind. At this point, it is definitely heading for the U.S. mainland. The current track looks like it's going to hit the Carolinas. So, boy, what a lousy month it's been. Between the X-class solar flares, the storms, Harvey, Irma, Jose, the mosquitoes. It's almost a biblical punishment being visited on the United States of America for all of its military aggressions. And of course, still looking at those earthquakes up there in Idaho, and there's definitely something going on there as well, so we have to be a little concerned. Meanwhile, Japan is getting very, very nervous over the fact that Russia and China's air forces seem to be flying around their country quite a bit, and they're now talking about how there's now pressure on Tokyo to boost military spending. Every time there's hostility or friction, everybody says, oh, we can't spend the taxpayers' money on the taxpayer. We've got to buy weapons. And I'm sure the weapons contractors, defense contractors are out there just having a field day. You know, these are golden times, a world going to war. We're just going to make so much money, it's going to be obscene. And again, this gets back to this issue with U.S. weapons, because when you go to these weapons fairs, if you will, more and more countries are starting to turn away from the U.S. products, because they've got a very lousy track record. F-22 still asphyxiating its pilots. F-35, huge list of problems still unresolved. Software for the cannon won't be available for another year. Apparently the cannon is so powerful it's actually distorting the frame of the aircraft. And they've temporarily solved that by putting the gun in a pod that mounts on the center line of the belly, adding more weight and bulk to the aircraft. Still cannot get the so-called transparent airplane display to work, line up. Can't get the networked radar system to have the correct number of targets shared among the flight. Just goes on and on and on. Still a problem with the insulation in the fuel tank working loose, getting into the engines and blowing them up. You've got the Zumwalt drivetrain problems, and apparently because of that inverted bow, very unstable in a beam C. We were talking about the littoral combat ships. The Independence-class littoral combat ships, hull corrosion. The lead ships already had to go back into dry dock and have sections of the hull replaced. The Freedom-class littoral combat ships, drivetrain problems. And last week we reported on the story about how the Navy is now saying, well, these really aren't going to work. We spent a lot of money on them, but they're really not going to work. We need something new. And so they're going to launch a whole new program for a whole new boondoggle. Because that's what they seem to do. Go from one boondoggle to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's great for those defense contractors who are mostly focused on selling to the Pentagon. But when they take those same weapons and they go on out and try and sell them to other countries, the other countries are saying, very expensive, not really ready to go when delivered. I mean, those countries that are taking the F-35 right now are taking it on the understanding there are still components yet to be delivered. Meanwhile, Russia has been using Syria as a real-world demonstration of how their weapons are working, and they work just fine, and they're nowhere near as expensive. You've got the Gerald R. Ford, the latest aircraft carrier, most expensive warship the U.S. has ever built, full of all kinds of new high-tech gadgets like electromagnetic catapults. New radars, can't get those things to work. And now the Pentagon is admitting maybe they shouldn't have tried putting so many new untried systems in a single hull, because they're saying that, like the littoral combat ships, they may never actually be usable in real-world combat. So it's a mess out there. Now, there's a cautionary note in all of this, and that is that all wars are not only economic in the cause, they're economic in the outcome. Because the first country to run out of money loses. And if you have built up your military force with these ultra expensive, high maintenance, high breakdown weapons, and you're up against an enemy that has been very cost effective, getting as much bang for their buck as they can, then you're already at a disadvantage. But it almost seems like Washington, D.C. has gotten itself into a real corner. We're seeing all these indications that the economy can't be propped up anymore. We're hearing these rumors about how the first of the year, the United Nations and the IMF are going to say we need to move away from the dollar-centric global reserve system. Venezuela's dropping the dollar. All sorts of other countries, the BRICS nations, more countries are signing on with BRICS. It's only a matter of time before it falls apart. And so it seems like out of an act of sheer desperation is why the U.S. government wants to get a major war going, in the hope that it will somehow magically fix the economy, which it doesn't. It just builds up more debt, or at least have a distraction and somebody to blame for the economic crash. It's not our fault you're hungry and homeless and jobless. It's those gosh darn Russians. It's those gosh darn Iranians. But when you look at just how desperate it seems the U.S. is to start a major war somewhere, anywhere, North Korea, Iran, maybe Russia head on, you can almost smell that desperation to get a major conflict going somewhere. You've even got the United Nations out there saying that Iran is complying with the P5+1 deal. And yet you have the U.S. war hawks out there screaming that Iran has to be invaded. Why? Why does Iran have to be invaded? They're not a nuclear threat to the United States. They're not a threat to to the United States anyway, other than that they sell their oil for currencies other than the dollar. And they're one of the few remaining countries on earth that do not have private central banks. But it's time for all Americans to basically step back and just forget about all the propaganda you've been hearing on TV about the Iraq threat and the Syria threat and the Libya threat. And just keep a little checklist. Who is invading who? Did Libya attack the United States of America? Did Iraq attack the United States of America? Did Syria attack the United States of America? Did Yemen attack the United States of America? No, they just want to mind their own business and not be messed around with. But if you go on back to the 1990s and that Project for the New American Century, they set it as a U.S. policy that the U.S. government was going to go on out and find some way to control all the other countries on the face of planet Earth, either by regime change or outright invasion. It's the U.S. government that is the aggressor. It is the U.S. government that is provoking the violence. And it almost seems there's so much of it that we, the American people, are starting to get numb to it, and that is a very dangerous situation. When they're talking about 2,000 civilian casualties in Mosul, that should be a shocking story to all of us. We shouldn't allow ourselves to become numb to the horrors of war, especially horrors of war crafted and created by our own government in our name. It's very important we, the American people, continue to stand up and say we do not support these wars. We do not agree with them. The government does not have our permission or blessing for these wars. We cannot make the same mistake the people of Germany did in World War II, where they thought they were just going to be the good Germans, and even though they opposed the policies and wars of the Nazis, they just stayed quiet in the hope that they would be left alone. And two things resulted from that. First of all, they weren't left alone. They lost their country. They lost the war. And at the end of World War II, there was hideous amounts of starvation and disease they had to deal with because they stayed quiet. Second, and most important, generations after World War II lump all the German people together with the Nazis because there had been no voices standing up and saying, we're not with them. And I don't want to see our future generations have to deal with that, the collective guilt. And that's why it's so important that we all continue to stand up and say, no, we don't agree with any of this. We're powerless to stop it, sadly. But don't for a second think that our inability to get our government back under our democratic control means that they have our consent to move forward with these atrocities that are being committed across the globe. Because they aren't. It's never been more important for the American people to stand up and be heard by the rest of the world. So, let's see. Got a comment here about the Larry Silverstein caller. Just for your information, the guy that called about Larry asking why no one attacked him for 9/11, he called into John Stadmiller's show a few months ago and almost verbatim said the same things on John's show. In my opinion, he's either delusional or a paid shill. Well, yeah, that's big business. Public relations firms are paid to lie on behalf of the government. They're paid to provide people for talk shows or online blogs to argue the government's point of view. And you have to wonder what kind of a human being is willing to accept money to just go on out there and lie about these things. Because it's not like it's a little lie like, do I look fat in these slacks? We're talking about people who, for their 30 pieces of silver, are messing with the future of our entire country. And that's what's going to happen. If they succeed in helping the government lie us into a new world war. Millions are going to die, and part of that blood is going to be on the hands of all these paid online shills and paid phone callers into the radio programs. So, somebody just sent me a map of South Yellowstone with all of these little quakes and everything mapped on out. Yeah, if I were living in that part of the country, I'd be concerned. Actually, if it's a supervolcano eruption, we should be concerned wherever we are. There's really nothing you can do about it. And somebody wrote in to ask about Larry Silverstein's comment about Pull It, and asking if he had a dentist appointment that morning. All right, well, what that was all about, Larry Silverstein was giving an interview about how World Trade Center 7 came on down. Now, remember, prior to 9/11 and ever since, no steel frame building has ever collapsed from fire. Only on 9/11 are we told that is what happened. And there was a lot of confusion going on. Again, there's that 26-minute delay between when the BBC reported Building 7 had collapsed and it actually happened. Somebody got off the timeline, and maybe they hadn't gotten the building fully evacuated. Remember, Giuliani actually was on video saying he'd been told the building was going to collapse. Then later on, he denied it. And there's probably a good reason for that because, again, going into 9/11, no steel frame building had ever collapsed from fire. Building 7 was built extra strong and fireproof because it held federal offices. There was no way anybody could know it was going to collapse unless they had their finger on the demolition switch. So Silverstein was caught on tape talking about how they decided they were just going to get the firefighters out of Building 7 and pull it. And a lot of people seized on that because pull it is a slang term from the world of controlled demolition, meaning bring it down. Okay, we're going to take another phone call. Craig in Seattle, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Thank you, sir. I was wondering if you could touch base on the report of the 2,000 pounds of explosives on the George Washington Bridge on that day.
Well, there were a lot of weird reports going on that day. There was even supposedly somebody in Arab clothing that was seen walking along the bridge, which is like, what is Arab clothing? Was this guy dressed like Lawrence of Arabia or something? Which, again, right from the beginning, they were trying to sell, Arab Muslim terror, Arab Muslim terror. We know that a lot of these trucks that belong to urban moving systems tested positive for explosives. As to whether or not real explosives were found on the George Washington Bridge, we don't know. It may have happened and been covered up. Again, you need to go back to that Carl Cameron's 4-part story on Fox News on the Israeli spy ring, where a government official confirmed there was evidence linking those Israelis to 9/11, but that it was all classified by the United States government. But I remember hearing that report on the day that it happened, that there was a van full of explosives on the George Washington Bridge. But the bridge is still there, so whatever was supposed to happen didn't. Do you have anything more for us, Craig?
Yeah, just, there was confirmed by the New York City Police Department and the FBI field office of the New York City. And also was on, and the reason why I remember seeing it on TV.
Okay, I'm going to put you on hold. I'm going to put you on hold. I'll bring you back after the commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're still talking with Craig in Seattle. And we're talking about, there were a lot of things being reported on 9/11. And yes, one of them I remember was this report that there was a van full of explosives on the George Washington Bridge. And it got a lot of coverage. And then all of a sudden it went away. And I would theorize that the police actually found the van and discovered that whoever was driving it didn't line up with the official story of Arab terrorists, and so that's why that story had to vanish.
Well, yeah, even though they were attached, that van was to the urban moving, pardon me.
Yeah, urban moving system.
Company?
Yeah, urban moving system.
Was that van attached to them? Was it linked to that?
Yes.
They were. Okay. Well, again, Mike, thank you so much to you and your wife, what you guys are doing, and I hope you make it to Seattle and some speaking engagements or something like that, possibly in the future. But Thank you. Keep up the great work and appreciate all your time and what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, Claire and I actually lived just outside Seattle for a couple of years, year and a half actually, and we really liked it. We really did. We lived in North Bend, and
okay, very familiar with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks an awful lot.
Beautiful. Thank you, sir.
All right, we'll let you go here. Now then, over on whatreallyhappened.com, people are starting to post follow-up stories on 9/11. Apparently, somebody told the Prime Minister of Denmark the first tower was going to collapse. Who told him and how did they know? Now, remember, those World Trade Towers were designed to survive being hit by a plane because there was actually an incident where a B-25 crashed into the Empire State Building. And even though the area is technically a no-fly zone, anything is possible, and the World Trade Towers were designed to survive a direct head-on impact of a fully loaded, fully fueled Boeing 707. And the 757 is a somewhat lighter aircraft. Apparently, Microsoft's self-learning robot decided that 9/11 was an inside job. So who says computers aren't gaining intelligence here? The Office of Emergency Management issued a collapse warning for World Trade Center 7. How did they know? How could they know when no steel frame building had ever collapsed from fire prior to 9/11? Especially a building that was built extra strong, extra fireproof, extra rugged because it held federal government offices. Somebody posted a video of some of the eyewitnesses to the World Trade Center lobby explosion. So this idea that there are no witnesses, that it's all fake and everything, that's part of the poison the well propaganda tactic that they're trying to use to sow discord and just keep everybody arguing about whether or not there was a plane at the Pentagon. But at this point, one thing is obvious. We know we were lied to about 9/11. We all agree on that. Let's decide what we're going to do with the government that lies to us. There's the music. Time for me to get on out of here. I got to do the Jim Goddard show up there in Vancouver. Please stay tuned for John Stedmiller's program. He's got a lot of interesting things to share with you. Take what you learn here, share it with everyone that you know. We still have we have to push back against this war machine before they blow us all up. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.